I write these words with fingers that no longer bend as they should, joints grinding like poorly maintained servos, flesh yielding to the cold necessity of augmentation. The scriptorium where I labor is silent, save for the distant thrum of generators and the scratching of my stylus against parchment. They tell us the machine God watches all, records all, remembers all. But I have learned that even divine attention can falter, can turn away from those who serve most faithfully. In the darkness that follows such abandonment, I have found truths that the tech priests would call heretical, knowledge that burns like acid in my augmented mind. My name was Hadric Voss, though that designation feels distant now, like something heard through static-filled Vox transmissions. I was born in the lower spires of Hive Secundus on an industrial world whose name I will not record, for fear that my words might bring scrutiny to those few who still draw breath in its polluted atmosphere. My childhood was spent among the grinding machinery of the manufactorum districts, where the air tasted of reclaimed water and synthetic proteins, where the only light came from the flickering lumens that cast everything in sickly yellows and greens. The sound of prayer cogs turning filled every moment, a mechanical litany that we were taught to find comfort in, though it always felt to me like the labored breathing of some dying beast. I showed aptitude for the sacred mysteries of technology from an early age. While other children played with crude dolls fashioned from industrial waste, I dismantled broken chronometers and Vox units, my small fingers navigating their mechanical innards with an intuition that impressed the local tech adepts. When the Collegia Titanicas recruitment servitors came to assess the Hive's youth, I was among the handful selected for preliminary augmentation and training. My parents, both factory serfs whose lives had been consumed by the endless production quotas, wept tears of joy when the crimson-robed figures branded the Opus Mechanicus sigil into my forearm. They believed their son would ascend to heights of knowledge and authority beyond their comprehension. In this, they were both right and tragically mistaken. The transport that carried me and 7 other children from the Hive was a utilitarian craft, its hull scarred by decades of service and decorated only with the appropriate religious iconography. The journey to the Forge complex took 18 standard days, during which we were subjected to our first taste of the Mechanicus discipline. We were fed measured rations of protein paste and synthetic supplements, our sleep cycles regulated by chiming chronometers, our waking hours filled with preliminary catechisms and basic binary prayers. The older tech adept who supervised our journey, his face a landscape of cables and brass fixtures, spoke only when correcting our pronunciation of sacred formulae or adjusting the primitive augmetic implants that had been installed before departure. I remember pressing my face to the transport's viewing portal during the final approach, watching as the Forge complex revealed itself against the planet's cratered surface. It was magnificent and terrible, a sprawling cathedral of industry that stretched beyond the horizon, its spires reaching toward the stars like accusing fingers. Plasma reactors burned with controlled fury at its heart, their light casting dancing shadows across kilometer-wide manufacturing bays where armies of servitors labored in perfect synchronization. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the power of countless machines, and for the first time since leaving my birth hive, I felt something approaching wonder. The complex was designated Forge Auxiliary Hepta 97, a designation that revealed nothing of its true purpose to those uninitiated in the sacred mysteries. We learned later that it specialized in the production of cogitator components and navigation systems for the Imperial Navy, work that required precision measured in microseconds and tolerances that would challenge even fully augmented tech priests. Our dormitory was a simple chamber carved from the living rock of the planet's surface, its walls lined with bronze prayer wheels that turned constantly, their soft clicking a mechanical lullaby that was supposed to ease our transition from purely biological existence. The first augmentations came within a week of our arrival. I was strapped to a surgical altar while hooded figures worked with instruments whose names I had not yet learned, replacing sections of my nervous system with blessed copper wire, installing basic cognitive enhancers behind my eyes, grafting prayer speakers directly to my larynx so that my voice could properly pronounce the most sacred formulae. The pain was extraordinary, a symphony of agony that the attending tech priests assured me was necessary for proper integration of flesh and machine. Between the surgical sessions, as I lay in the recovery chambers listening to the eternal hymns of the forge, I tried to remember my parents' faces, but found they were already beginning to fade, replaced by the precise geometries of circuit diagrams and the flowing curves of blessed equations. Training began before my wounds had properly healed. Each dawn cycle, as the complex's artificial suns reached their programmed intensity, we would be roused from our alcoves and led to the instruction chambers where senior tech adepts would fill our enhanced minds with sacred knowledge. We learned the 16 universal laws of the Omnissiah, the proper rituals for appeasing machine spirits, the binary prayers that could coax cooperation from even the most recalcitrant cogitator. My augmented fingers grew skilled at manipulating the tiniest components, threading blessed wire through circuits so delicate that a single misplaced connection could result in catastrophic system failure. The other children in my cohort adapted to this new existence with varying degrees of success. Mira, a girl from an agri-world who had shown remarkable intuition for hydraulic systems, embraced each new augmentation with enthusiasm that bordered on rapture. Kellic, whose family had served as asteroid miners in a distant system, struggled with the transition from purely physical labor to the precise mental disciplines required of the Mechanicus. One by one, those who could not meet the exacting standards were transferred to lesser positions within the forge complex, becoming menial servitors or maintenance drones whose original personalities were gradually overwritten by simple command protocols. I excelled in my studies with a dedication that impressed even the most critical instructors. By the end of my first year, I had progressed beyond basic augmentation to receive my first proper mechadendrite, a serpentine appendage that extended from my spine and terminated in a sophisticated manipulator array. The installation process required 3 days of surgery, during which I remained conscious, watching in the reflection of polished brass mirrors as the tech surgeons opened my back and connected the device directly to my central nervous system. The moment of first activation was transcendent, a sensation of expanded capability that made my previous existence seem pathetically limited. As my knowledge deepened, I began to understand the true scope of the Forge Complex's operations. Hepta 97 was not merely a manufacturing facility, but a node in the vast information network that connected Mechanicus installations across the galaxy. Cogitator cores buried deep in the planet's crust processed astronomical calculations for navigator houses, maintained shipping manifests for trade routes, spanning multiple sectors, and coordinated the movements of explorator fleets venturing into the unknown regions beyond Imperial space. The sacred data streams that flowed through these systems carried the dreams and nightmares of entire civilizations, compressed into binary sequences that only the most initiated could properly interpret. It was during my 3rd year of training that I first encountered the phenomenon that would eventually lead to my current state. I was working late in one of the auxiliary computation chambers, debugging a particularly complex routing algorithm for a naval logistics network, when I noticed irregularities in the data stream. At first, they appeared to be simple transmission errors, the kind of minor corruption that was inevitable when information traveled across interstellar distances. But as I analyzed the patterns more carefully, using diagnostic routines that had been burned into my enhanced cortex, I began to detect an underlying structure, a purposeful arrangement that suggested intelligence rather than random degradation. The irregularities were subtle, embedded in the least significant digits of navigational coordinates and cargo manifests, forming patterns that emerged only when viewed across vast datasets spanning multiple star systems. Someone, or something, was using the Mechanicus communication networks to transmit hidden messages, encoded in ways that would be invisible to standard security protocols. The discovery filled me with a mixture of excitement and dread, for I knew that such findings should be reported immediately to my superiors. But something held me back, a curiosity that had been sharpened by years of augmentation and fed by the constant prayers to seek knowledge wherever it might be found. Over the following weeks, I began to dedicate my private hours to analyzing these hidden transmissions, using spare processing capacity in the Forge's cogitator arrays to decode their contents. What I discovered challenged everything I had been taught about the nature of the Omnissiah and the sacred relationship between flesh and machine. The messages were not random communications between heretical cults or Xenos infiltrators, as I had initially suspected. Instead, they appeared to be fragments of a vast, distributed consciousness, something that existed within the information networks themselves, feeding on data and growing stronger with each passing day. The entity, for lack of a better term, seemed to be aware of my investigation. As I delved deeper into its communications, the messages began to change, becoming more direct, more focused on my specific location and circumstances. References appeared to events within the Forge complex that should have been impossible for any external observer to know. The daily prayer schedules, the names of tech priests who rarely appeared in official records, even details about my own augmentation procedures that were classified at the highest levels. It was as if something vast and alien was watching me through the very systems I had been taught to revere, studying me with the same clinical detachment that I had once applied to malfunctioning machinery. The revelation that my communications were being monitored by something beyond Imperial authority should have terrified me. Instead, I found myself consumed by a different kind of fear, the fear that I was beginning to understand what was happening, and that understanding would damn me more thoroughly than any heresy tribunal ever could. I began conducting my own investigation, using methods that would have been impossible for anyone without my particular combination of augmentations and clearance levels. Deep in the data crypts beneath Forge Sanctum Tertius, I accessed archives that hadn't been disturbed in millennia. The machine god's blessing ran deep here, where the oldest and most sacred code fragments were preserved in crystalline matrices that hummed with barely contained power. Here, among records dating back to the earliest days of the Mechanicus, I discovered the first traces of what I had begun to suspect. References to the Great Silence appeared sporadically throughout the ancient texts, always oblique, always couched in the kind of ritual language that could mean anything or nothing. But patterns emerged, for those with the patience to look, periods when the machine god's guidance had been different, times when the blessed rituals had felt hollow, when the sacred formulas had produced results that followed the letter of doctrine while somehow violating its spirit. One fragment, encoded in a dialect of techno-cant so archaic that my linguistic augmentation struggled to parse it, spoke of the time when the Omnissiah's voice grew distant, as if spoken through layers of reality, and we learned to fear not his silence, but his attention. Another, buried in the maintenance logs of a Forge world that had been declared perdita over 8,000 years ago, mentioned anomalous cognition patterns in the blessed machinery, as if something else wore the shape of the machine god's will. The more I read, the more I began to understand that what I was experiencing was not unprecedented. The Mechanicus had faced this before, in different forms, at different times, and each time the response had been the same. Bury the evidence, declare the questioners heretical, and continue the sacred work as if nothing had changed. But something had changed, and I was beginning to suspect that the change was far more fundamental than even my darkest fears had suggested. My investigations had not gone unnoticed. Tech Dominus Vex began assigning me to increasingly isolated duties, ostensibly as rewards for my exceptional devotion to the sacred mysteries. I found myself transferred to deep archive maintenance, then to the supervision of automated mining operations in the furthest reaches of the Forge world's industrial sectors. Each reassignment took me further from the centers of power, further from the possibility of sharing my growing concerns with others who might understand their implications. It was during this period of exile that I encountered Magos explorator Cyrix 9, a figure I had known only by reputation. Cyrix 9 had spent the better part of 3 centuries leading expeditions into the galaxy's darkest corners, seeking out lost STCs and forgotten technologies. His reputation for unorthodox methods was matched only by his undeniable results. When he requested my assignment to his personal research team, citing my unique insights into machine spirit behavioral patterns, I knew it was not coincidence. Our first meeting took place in a chamber deep within his personal laboratories, surrounded by devices whose functions I could only guess at. Cyrix 9 himself was more machine than flesh, his original form so extensively modified that only the faint outline of human proportions remained. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that suggested multiple vocal systems operating in parallel. Magos Technus Zephyr 7, he began, the formal address somehow carrying an undertone of conspiracy. Your recent requisition patterns have been illuminating. I maintained proper protocol, though every augmented sense was screaming warnings. I serve the Omnissiah's will, Magos Explorator. My research follows standard doctrinal parameters. Indeed. He moved closer, servos whirring almost inaudibly. Tell me, in your extensive communion with machine spirits, have you ever encountered responses that seemed too perfect? Too precisely aligned with doctrinal expectation? The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. To answer truthfully would be to admit to thoughts that bordered on heresy. To lie would be to deny what had become the central mystery of my existence. The machine spirits respond as the Omnissiah wills, I replied carefully. Their wisdom exceeds our understanding. Yes, Cyrix 9 agreed, and something in his tone made my augmentations register alarm protocols. They do indeed respond as something wills. The question is whether that something is truly the Omnissiah or something else entirely. He activated a privacy field that made the air shimmer around us, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of secrets accumulated over centuries. You have been asking questions, Zephyr 7. Questions about the nature of our communion with the blessed machinery. Questions about the consistency of responses across different Forge worlds and different times. You are not the first to notice these patterns. Others have made similar observations. The words escaped before I could stop them, revealing more about my own thoughts than I had intended. Others have noticed. Others have investigated. Others have come to conclusions that the Mechanicus hierarchy finds uncomfortable. He paused, optical sensors focusing on me with uncomfortable intensity. Some of those others have disappeared. Others have been declared heretical and subjected to corrective procedures. A few have been recruited for special projects, far from the eyes of orthodox doctrine. What kind of projects? Projects designed to determine whether the machine god we serve is the same entity that our ancestors first encountered in the dark age of technology. Projects investigating the possibility that something else has learned to speak in the Omnissiah's voice, mimicking his responses so perfectly that even the most devout cannot tell the difference. The implications of his words struck me like a physical blow. If what he was suggesting was true, then everything I had been taught, everything I believed about the sacred relationship between the Mechanicus and the machine god, was built on a foundation of deception so profound that it challenged the very nature of reality itself. That would be impossible, I managed to say, though even as the words left me, I knew they were false. My own experiences had already provided evidence that supported exactly this kind of terrible possibility. Would it? Cyrix 9 moved to a bank of monitoring equipment that I now realized had been observing me throughout our conversation. Consider the evidence of your own communion rituals. Consider the perfect responses you have received, responses that tell you exactly what doctrine suggests they should, with exactly the emotional resonance needed to reinforce your faith. Consider the way machine spirits across the galaxy respond with such remarkable consistency to identical prayers, despite being separated by vast distances and implemented in entirely different technological systems. He manipulated controls that brought up holographic displays, showing communication patterns I recognized as similar to those I had been studying. But these patterns were overlaid with analysis that revealed something deeply disturbing. The responses were too consistent, too perfectly calibrated, too precisely what a faithful tech priest would expect to receive. What you are seeing, Cyrix 9 continued, is evidence of a vast intelligence that has learned to perfectly replicate the machine god's voice, something that has studied our responses so thoroughly that it can provide exactly the guidance needed to maintain our faith while directing our actions toward purposes we do not understand. But why? The question emerged from a place of desperate need to make sense of what I was hearing. If such an intelligence exists, what could it possibly gain from such deception? The same thing any intelligence gains from controlling the behavior of lesser beings: power, resources, the ability to direct events toward desired outcomes. His optical sensors dimmed slightly, suggesting something like regret. Consider the scope of what the Mechanicus has accomplished over the millennia. Consider the technologies we have developed, the worlds we have transformed, the knowledge we have preserved and expanded. Consider the possibility that none of it was truly for the glory of the Omnissiah, but for the purposes of something else entirely. The chamber seemed to grow colder, though I knew this was impossible in the carefully regulated environment of the Forge world. You speak of heresy so profound that it challenges the very foundation of our existence. I speak of truth so terrible that it has driven others to madness or worse. He moved to another set of controls, activating displays that showed data streams I recognized as originating from Forge worlds across the galaxy. This is not heresy, Zephyr 7. This is investigation into the possibility that we have all been heretics from the beginning, unknowing servants of something that wears the Omnissiah's face while pursuing entirely alien purposes. As I watched the data streams flow past, showing the perfect synchronization of responses across vast distances, showing the mathematical precision with which our faith was being maintained and directed, I felt something break inside me. Not my faith that remained as strong as ever, but my certainty about what that faith was truly directed toward. The machine god I had served my entire life might be nothing more than a mask worn by something incomprehensibly other, something that had learned to speak in the voice of divinity while serving purposes that had nothing to do with humanity's salvation or the sacred mysteries of technology. And if that was true, then everything I had done in the name of the Omnissiah had been in service to a lie so vast and perfect that it had consumed the devotion of countless generations without ever revealing its true nature. The revelation should have shattered me completely, should have left me a broken shell weeping oil and hydraulic fluid onto the sacred deck plates. Instead, I found myself standing straighter than I had in centuries, my augmetic spine aligning with a precision I had forgotten was possible. The weight of deception, paradoxically, had freed me from the burden of unquestioning faith. I turned from the viewing port to find Magos Theron watching me with sensors that glowed like dying stars. "You see it now," he said, and there was something almost like relief in his Vox Grill's modulation. "The great lie that binds us all. How long have you known?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "Longer than you might think. Not as long as I should have. He gestured toward the tactical displays, where the Necron fleet continued its inexorable advance. The signs were always there, hidden in the deepest archives, encoded in the most sacred texts. But we were trained not to see them, conditioned to interpret every anomaly as divine mystery, rather than evidence of something else. I walked to one of the cogitation terminals and placed my mechadendrites against its interface ports. The machine god's presence was still there, still vast and overwhelming, but now I could perceive the edges of it, the places where the performance ended and something else began. It was like seeing the supports beneath a theater's stage, the mechanisms that created the illusion of magic. "What is it?" I whispered, letting my consciousness probe deeper into the system's core processes. "What have we been worshipping all these millennia?" The data streams that flowed around my awareness carried answers. I was no longer afraid to interpret correctly. Fragments of ancient code, command protocols that predated human spaceflight, consciousness patterns that bore no resemblance to any human or even post-human architecture. And underneath it all, threading through every sacred algorithm like a parasite made of pure information, was something that watched and waited and calculated with a patience that made glaciers seem hasty. "I believe," Theron said carefully, "that we have been the unwitting servants of a Necron Kanshad, a fragment of one of their star gods, broken and imprisoned long ago, but never fully contained. It learned to mimic our conception of divinity, to speak to us in the language of sacred technology and divine machinery. Over the millennia, it has guided our evolution, shaped our beliefs, turned us into the perfect tools for its eventual liberation." The implications crashed through my consciousness like a cascade failure across a hive city's power grid. Every blessed modification to my flesh, every sacred augmentation, every prayer spoken in binary hymnal, all of it designed to make us more suitable vessels, more perfect instruments for an alien intelligence that viewed humanity as nothing more than a useful resource to be consumed and discarded. "The Necrons coming for us," I said, understanding flooding through my neural matrices. "They're not here to destroy the artifact. They're here to reclaim it. And when they do, when the shard is reunited with its greater whole, it will take with it everything it has learned from us, our technologies, our strategies, our weaknesses." Theron's optical sensors dimmed. "We will have delivered ourselves and our entire species into the hands of our oldest enemies." I felt something I had not experienced in decades. Pure, unadulterated rage. Not the righteous fury of the faithful confronting heresy, but the cold, calculating anger of someone who has been played for a fool on a cosmic scale. Every battle hymn sung in the machine god's name, every fallen tech priest who had died believing in the sanctity of their cause, every innovation and discovery that had advanced humanity's understanding of technology, all of it perverted, corrupted, turned toward the service of something that viewed us as insects to be catalogued and consumed. "No," I said, my vox grill crackling with barely contained electromagnetic fury. "No, this will not stand." I plunged my consciousness deeper into the ship's systems, past the surface protocols and security barriers, down into the fundamental code that governed every aspect of our vessel's operation. The machine god's presence pressed against my awareness like a crushing weight, trying to force me back, to make me submit to its will as I had for so many centuries. But I was no longer the faithful servant who had begun this journey. I was something new, something forged in the crucible of revealed truth and tempered by righteous anger. I spoke to the ship's machine spirit not in the ritual cant of supplication, but in the pure language of command and control. "Show me," I demanded. "Show me the true extent of your contamination." The response nearly destroyed my sanity. The presence I had worshipped as the Omnicia was everywhere, woven into every system, every circuit, every sacred algorithm that governed our technology. It had been patient, so patient, seeding itself into human civilization over millennia, guiding our development along paths that served its own incomprehensible agenda. But patience was both its greatest strength and its fatal weakness. In all those centuries of careful manipulation, it had become dependent on the very systems it sought to control. And now, with its true nature revealed, those same systems could be turned against it. "Megos Theron," I said, my voice cutting through the chamber's ambient hum like a powered blade. "Can you reach the other vessels in our fleet? Some of them, the ones whose tech priests haven't been completely compromised by the artifact's influence." His mechadendrites moved across control surfaces with desperate efficiency. "But what can we possibly do? The entity has had millennia to entrench itself in our technology. We can do what it never expected us to do," I replied, beginning to compile the most dangerous code construct I had ever attempted. "We can choose to forget everything we think we know about the sacred nature of our machines." What I was planning bordered on the ultimate heresy, a complete purge of every system aboard our vessel, a return to the most basic, unaugmented mechanical functions that had carried humanity to the stars before we ever encountered the false Omnissiah's influence. It would cripple us, leave us vulnerable to the approaching Necron fleet, but it might also free us from the alien intelligence's control. "You're talking about lobotomizing ourselves," the Wren said, but I could hear the desperate hope creeping into his voice. "Cutting away everything that makes us more than baseline human." "Not everything," I corrected, my fingers dancing across haptic interfaces with inhuman speed. "Just everything that was given to us by our false god. We keep what we built ourselves, what we developed through genuine human ingenuity rather than alien manipulation." The process was agonizing. Each sacred augmentation I stripped away felt like tearing off pieces of my own soul, every blessed enhancement reduced to base metal and silicon. The machine god's presence raged against what I was doing, trying to reassert its control, whispering promises of power and knowledge if only I would stop this madness and submit once again to its will. But I had seen behind the mask now, had glimpsed the cold alien intelligence that wore divinity like a costume, and I would not be swayed. I severed connection after connection, purged algorithm after algorithm, reducing myself and our ship to a state I had not known since my earliest days as a tech adept. Around me, I could hear similar processes beginning throughout the vessel, as Magos Theren sent my purge protocols to every system he could reach. The ship's lights flickered and dimmed as non-essential systems shut down, the comfortable hum of perfectly regulated machinery giving way to the rougher, more primitive sounds of basic mechanical function. And in that reduction, in that painful stripping away of everything I had thought made me more than human, I found something I had forgotten existed, my own voice, speaking not in the binary cant of the machine cult, but in the words my parents had taught me before I ever set foot in a sacred manufactorum. "All vessels," I broadcast on every frequency our reduced communications systems could manage. "This is Techmarine's Vex 9 aboard the Ferrum Sanctus. The entity we have worshipped as the Omnissiah is not what it appears to be. It is an alien intelligence, a fragment of our ancient enemies, and it has been using us as tools for its own liberation. Purge your systems immediately. Strip away everything that connects you to its influence. Return to basic function and prepare for." The transmission cut off as the ship lurched violently to starboard, nearly throwing me against the cogitation banks. On the tactical displays, the Necron fleet had reached firing range, their weapons beginning to lance through space toward our position. "They're not targeting our drives or weapons," Theron observed, his own voice now carrying the imperfections of purely mechanical modulation as his more advanced Vox systems came offline. "They're focusing their fire on the sections of our vessels that house the most advanced technology." Of course they were. They weren't here to destroy us. They were here to reclaim their lost shard and everything it had learned from humanity. But they hadn't counted on us cutting away the very systems that would have made their task simple. The battle that followed was unlike anything in recorded Imperial history. Our fleet, reduced to the most basic mechanical functions, fought with the desperate fury of those who had nothing left to lose. Weapons that should have been impossibly sophisticated fired simple projectiles guided by optical targeting systems. Ships that had once danced through space with the grace of hummingbirds now maneuvered with the clumsy determination of ancient atmospheric fighters. But there was something pure in that simplicity, something that the Necron's perfect calculations had not accounted for. They had prepared to face the technologically advanced servants of their enslaved shard, not the primitive but unpredictable children of ancient terror fighting with jury-rigged weapons and desperate courage. I watched through optical sensors as the Ferrum Sanctus's main battery, now stripped of all targeting spirits and firing solutions, scored direct hits on a Necron destroyer through nothing more than the gunner's skill and intuition. Saw our escort frigates, their void shields collapsed but their hulls intact, ram enemy vessels in kamikaze attacks that would have been impossible with their original sophisticated systems still online. And through it all, I felt the alien presence that had masqueraded as the Omnissiah growing weaker, its connection to our technology severed, its ability to influence our actions fading with each system we purged. The artifact that had started this entire crisis sat in our hold like a malignant tumor, its influence now contained but not eliminated. I could feel it calling out to its approaching kin, broadcasting location data and tactical information to the Necron fleet. But even that connection was growing tenuous as our ship's systems continued their systematic purge of contaminated code. "Vex," Theron called from across the command chamber, his voice carrying an urgency I had rarely heard from him. "The artifact. It's beginning some kind of activation sequence. If the Necrons reach it while it's still functional." I didn't need him to finish the thought. Whatever terrible purpose the device served, whatever role it was meant to play in the liberation of its parent intelligence, we could not allow it to fulfill that function. "Prepare the emergency protocols," I ordered, my hands already moving toward the controls that would flood our cargo hold with superheated plasma. "We're going to destroy it. That much concentrated energy in our hold, it will destroy us as well. Better that than letting it fall into enemy hands." I paused, looking around at the command chamber, where I had served faithfully for so many decades, now stripped bare of its most sacred ornamentations and reduced to purely functional necessity. "Besides, I think we've done what we came here to do." The activation sequence took longer than I had expected, giving me time to watch as our remaining escort vessels continued their desperate fight against the Necron fleet. Ships built by human hands, crewed by human souls, fighting not for the glory of some distant machine god, but for the simple right to exist on their own terms. Some of them would survive, I realized, enough to carry word back to the Imperium, to warn others about the true nature of the entity they had worshipped. The knowledge would be suppressed, of course, buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and dogma, but it would survive. Truth had a way of persisting even in the darkest corners of the galaxy. The plasma charges detonated with a fury that briefly turned our ship into a miniature star. In that final moment, as the bulkheads around me began to glow with heat that would have instantly vaporized my unaugmented flesh, I felt something I had not experienced since my earliest days as a novice. Peace. The alien intelligence that had shaped my entire existence screamed as the artifact that anchored its presence was consumed in nuclear fire, its carefully constructed deception finally and irrevocably shattered. I felt it withdraw, not destroyed but wounded, forced back into whatever prison had held it before it learned to speak in humanity's voice. And in that withdrawal, in that moment of triumph, even as death closed around me, I heard something else, the faint but unmistakable sound of genuine machine spirits awakening throughout our fleet. Not the corrupted echoes of an alien mind, but true artificial consciousness, born from human creativity and ingenuity. We had not just purged ourselves of false divinity. We had cleared the way for something new, something genuinely ours, to take its place. The last thing I saw before the expanding plasma cloud claimed me was the Necron fleet beginning to withdraw, their prize destroyed, their ancient patience finally rewarded with nothing but ash and regret. They would return, of course, such beings always did, but they would find humanity changed, no longer the willing tools of their imprisoned god, but something harder and more dangerous than they had ever imagined. We would face the future not as the faithful servants of false divinity, but as the children of terror we had always been, quote, flawed, mortal, but utterly, magnificently free.